Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel on the Blake Plateau. I'm Lisa Suatoni, the Deputy Director of the Oceans Division at NRDC, and I'm really excited to moderate this panel today on the Blake Plateau. The Blake Plateau is an expansive submerged plateau just beyond the continental shelf off the southeastern United States, and it's a very special place. But given its distance from shore and the depth of water in which it lies, it's a bit out of sight, out of mind. And in general, it's easy for these deep sea ecosystems to kind of fade into the background and out of our consciousness. So the purpose of the panel today is to elevate and celebrate the varied values of the Blake Plateau. And we're going to start with the past and move to the present. First, we will hear from marine archaeologist, Dr. Jim Delgado, who is currently the Senior Vice President of Search, Inc., and was the former Director of Maritime Heritage at NOAA. Jim will talk about the importance of the Gulf Stream and the Blake Plateau to our maritime history. Queen Quet, Chieftess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, will then share with us the spiritual importance of the ocean and the Blake Plateau to the Gullah Geechee people. And then we'll hear from Dr. Derek Sowers, Manager of Mapping Operations for Ocean Exploration Trust, also a former NOAA employee. And he will talk to us about the comprehensive mapping of the Blake Plateau. Lastly, we'll hear from Dr. Eric Cordes of Temple University, who will tell us about his research on corals in the Blake Plateau. After the speakers, Queen Quet will share a video that she made with us, and we will hold a Q&A. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A throughout, and we'll address them after all the speakers. So there's a lot to learn, and we shall begin. Bless you. Dr. Delgado.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of the amazing history of the Blake Plateau and its context with the larger ocean. The Blake Plateau sits essentially right at the line that the Gulf Stream literally runs right through. The Gulf Stream, known potentially for earlier cultures, but also known in more historic times, was first charted and then more specifically seen, starting with Spanish mariners, but then continuing on into the colonial era. It became very well known throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century and remained a subject of much interest. And with that, let's just start with a basic concept. Much of what we as human beings see with the ocean is that flat surface. Understanding currents, things of that sort, and what lies beneath is something entirely different and something that only gradually became known, particularly with early work by scientists, those with the U.S. Coast Survey and others who began to probe that Gulf Stream, but never were able to reach the bottom. But what we're also going to be hearing about today is that this ocean has strong cultural connections, and those cultural connections also include powerful spiritual belief. It would be remiss to not note that while the Gulf Stream was used and seen as an ocean highway for trade and commerce, it also very powerfully was part of the Middle Passage, the forced migration of captives brought from Africa for the purposes of enslaving them in America. And indeed, the Middle Passage terminated for many people in the waters of the Blake Plateau and then in the port of Charleston. The region continued to have a strong association for those who were brought as well as their descendants. And again, it's important to note, as we will be hearing later, the powerful importance both in terms of the activities of people working on those waters, but also beyond. And to that point, I also want to point out that while we oftentimes think of coastal adaptations to the maritime culture and people fishing and working in those waters as something more close to shore, rest assured that anybody who knew how to work on those waters, particularly the folks that had been brought there and had their own aquatic culture, were able to venture far offshore. And we see that not only in the relics of that time, with something as infamous as one of these slave tax badges from Charleston, indicating that this individual was a fisher, somebody that would be working out in those waters, but also through shipwrecks. One of the most powerful images of the late 19th century, painted at a time when Jim Crow had reared its head, and by some people seen as an allegory of the dilemma faced by people who are now facing the troubles that Jim Crow brought, is also a reminder that these waters were actively fished by people who did not look like me. They were fished by a wide range of folks from different cultures, and in some cases, some of those people that did work in that fishery were enslaved, followed by others who were later free. Back to this point of ocean trade and commerce, though, the regional trade networks of maritime trade from coastal New England down to the southern states and then around, using that Gulf Stream to kick in past the tip of Florida and go into the Gulf of Mexico, was profound. And from colonial times to the early American Republic and beyond, ships actively worked in these waters. What we don't know with any great accuracy is how many of these vessels were lost in that context. We do know that there are shipwrecks down there. We do know that there are wrecks that most likely date to this time period, as well as later. We may not always know the name, but what we do see when we find a shipwreck like this is a reminder that on the waters and ultimately on the bottom at Blake Plateau and adjacent continental shelf waters, as well as those off of Blake Ridge itself and the Blake Escarpment, there is a record of that history. But again, and most importantly, for cultural significance, it's not just the physical presence of something like a shipwreck on the bottom. It is the fact that this history played out with a variety of people. And oftentimes when we look at an area of the ocean like this, what we begin to understand is that those powerful human connections link many of us together in a common activity, that is working on those waters. And in that as well, many times these are not ships or names that will enter into the history books unless we take an endeavor like this and begin to look beyond the headlines at the regular flow of human history, particularly as it is born across the water. In the late 19th century, former sailing schooners, now out of other trades, were actively working, for example, on these waterfronts, carrying the commodities of trade and commerce, again, linking these communities, but also crossing these waters. One of the shipwrecks that has been encountered during ocean exploration in the Blake Plateau area is actually off of Blake Ridge, where colleagues found it close to 7 years ago. That wreck, initially thought to be an older vessel, and with this powerful artifact, that's a ship's sextant, along with the jug. Initially, we weren't quite sure what it was, but ultimately the Blake Ridge wreck, as found in 2018 and subsequently studied with other missions, turns out to be an early fishing vessel that most probably was associated with the port of Charleston, and we suspect has a direct connection to, given its time period, the use of enslaved persons in this fishery. It very well could be the context for this vessel. We don't know for sure without further excavation, but it, in its scattered few remains, nonetheless tells a powerful story that, even without a name, draws us back to an important context for what lies down there in the waters and below on the plateau. Other shipwrecks are better known. One of the wrecks that sits down there is the SS Central America, which sank in a hurricane in 1857 with a horrific loss of life. That wreck was ultimately found, and its treasures, it had a great amount of gold, were recovered by treasure hunters. But the real treasure of Central America, again, is tied to the events of the past and people caught up in these events, as the shipwreck itself as a time capsule that speaks to this period, as well as other periods. This is one that certainly made the headlines. Others didn't. But we also know that this extends into modern times. One wreck located during a NOAA survey not too long ago is the SS Bloody Marsh, which was lost during the Battle of the Atlantic, as German U-boats came to the coast of America and began attacking our shipping, in particular trying to stop tankers like Bloody Marsh from carrying that vital and necessary amount of oil that was needed to keep our warships going. Sunk by a German torpedo, Bloody Marsh still sits on the bottom there on the Blake Plateau, and a reminder again of a longstanding human history. And with that, the point I want to really stress here is that these special ocean places are connected to people. They are people's stories. And in that aspect of our culture, whether written and known or unknown until further inquiry comes along, is what helps make the Blake Plateau a very important part of what we do. I'll close by saying that that quest for learning more also includes one amazing voyage in 1969, where the Gulf Stream was transited by the submersible Ben Franklin, named for the fellow who first talked about the Gulf Stream and published that chart, and of course, a very famous American patriot. The Grumman Piccard PX-15, or the Ben Franklin, in its drift mission, went right through these waters. I want to close by saying that that spirit of investigation, that spirit of exploration and tapping into and learning more about it is absolutely essential. For me as an archaeologist, it helps connect us to the past, and it's a reminder of the importance of these places to people. But it also is a reminder, as I'm now with my colleagues, that that quest for exploration leads us into a world that offers far more, as does the Blake Plateau. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. We would love to hear from Queen Quet now about the meaning of this area to her people.
My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out to thee. My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out to me. They tried to break my will with the chains that weighed me down across the sea. They tried to break my will by taking me from my family. They tried to think that they could take what God had given unto me. But they only rooted me deeper in the spirit, you see. My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out. My spirit calls out to thee. Anisha showing thee. What did he? And what 100 children, crack teeth and corn. The Carolinas, Georgia, Florida. That way we soil and then planted deeper into the soil. Over 100 children would see. Then the sea islands and things like that. In the Atlantic, this just same place, what we call the Middle Passage and things like that. So way back a yonder, all when the teeth, them souls, but in the Igbo, Mandinka, Malenke, Yoruba, Gullah, Geechee, Mendi, Tendi, Ifik, Ibibio, the other rest of children. They have been no say. Them in the teeth, they shut in. What? Some of the back of them later, put it right down core, black core. Because we ain't going to be the richness of the Shalan. We ain't going now, America. So when we go out to the shoreline, they're upon we islands and things like that. We just stand there. But what? The other rest of them call Atlantic. We look across this your place, we go. The Middle Passage. And we take with time a tribute and things like that to ancestors who ever come upon the show. And they had to fight it with. And sometimes during them, rebellion on board, they lost. True. Whether was the one or basically. And they were trovable. And then I said, then a good cargo. Then treat me like we ain't been a nothing. Like they would have throw off the ballast from the boat. But monks all over on the see the snow or scratch out there. One thing that I labor with the souls of the sea. That a part of who I be. Because we be Gullah Geechee, anointed people. So unlike a lot of other people who come to our shorelines every year, especially at this time, the beginning of hurricane season is often the beginning of this hurricane of people swirling in to the sea islands, to get to the beaches, to stand there on the Atlantic Ocean, to sun a little while, never realizing that sun will never bake into them the same power and energy that has been placed into our skin by our DNA of those warrior class African people who are fighting their way across the Atlantic, fighting spiritually to remain alive, hoping that they would emerge from the bellies of these beasts and then be able to step back onto their shores in our Gullah that we call Africa today. Or those who realized they stepped onto foreign shores, the lands of North America, the sea islands, that's now the Gullah Geechee Nation. But when we, the descendants of those who made it on to the sea islands, step back toward the water, we say we know the water to bring we, the water gonna take we back. We know our ancestors' souls are there in that ocean. We know that they give us strength on land to continue to fight for the waters to be healed so that they can rest peacefully. So as much as you may see the things that have been charted, the things that have been sketched, to say that with those shipwrecks, what was spread out below, what you don't see are those bones of my ancestors that actually are the ground in which the coral reefs have grown, that they are intertwined, interconnected, the same way you see those human beings who are called black gold, black cargo, interconnected in this sacred family tree of the Gullah Geechee Nation flag. It is rooted in the sea islands, inextricably tied to the land. That's what that green represents. That gold is for the black gold richness that we brought into the land, but it is surrounded by blue, because that is for not only the indigo that some of our ancestors went to the grave with their hands tied in, but also that protection that the water gives us. It is for the waters that we crossed. It is for the Middle Passage. It is for the millions that were dragged through violently and brought to work for others across those million miles, across those knolls, through this space that we now call the Blake Plateau that lies there as part of the body of the Middle Passage. That is a sacred space in the Atlantic Ocean. So here I am as a representative of my ancestors and my people, who we be Gullah Geechee anointed people, praying that that anointing that we pray for, that we pour libation for, that we shout and we beat drums for as we stand the coast, will yet ripple those waves, and that healing will go out, and that we can protect this sacred space forever. And so today, during National Ocean Month and Capitol Hill Ocean Week, we call on you to join us in this deep dive about the Blake Plateau and why it should matter to you as much as it does to me and my people, intellectually, scientifically, and most of all, spiritually. Peace and blessings on this journey.
Thank you, Queen Quet, for that very powerful remembrance. We are going to shift to the science and to the present, more of the present and a recent scientific discovery that Dr. Derek Sowers will share with us.
Thank you very much. That was quite powerful, very hard to follow. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'm going to speak today, summarizing a lot of the mapping work that was done to explore and reveal the habitats on the Blake Plateau. This was the title slide here is recognizing some of the co-authors of the recent publication that basically synthesized the work of many, many people over many years. And a huge body of work by a ton of scientists that work in the region, some for their whole career, and many different ships. And this is just a synthesis of all that body of science and work. So just to acknowledge that. So just a quick reminder, what we're talking about here spatially. As you know, I think by now, the Blake Plateau is this very interesting area about 100 miles offshore of the current coastlines of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And the depths here that we're talking about are about 2,500 feet deep. So it's about half a mile underwater is the majority of that flat surface of the Blake Plateau. The image you see on the bottom right is an image from NOAA showing sea surface temperature. And I put this in to really highlight the size of the Gulf Stream current. That's the dark red water. It's moving out of the Gulf and up along, kind of paralleling the Florida coastline. And that's that, as Jim pointed out, that's a really key driver of the oceanography here. It's transporting about 2,000 times the annual average transport of water out of the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. So we're talking about a huge volume of water constantly bathing the Blake Plateau. And really, you can think of it as kind of a conveyor belt of food and energy. And that becomes really important when we think about when we show you where the distributions of these deep cold water coral habitats are on the Blake Plateau. Before I talk about some of the mapping that was done, a quick review of how far this technology has come over time. Initially, measurements for understanding of the depth of the ocean were taken by lead lines. So a chunk of lead on the end of a wire, spot measurements of depths. So we're getting some information about the seafloor, but very limited. Then there was the invention of single beam sonars, which was an echo sounder. So sending out a pulse of sound, waiting for the echo back and measuring the two-way travel time. And so we were getting more information about the depths, but again, not a complete picture of the habitats of the actual ocean seafloor. Then with the invention of multi-beam sonars really coming into play commercially in the 80s, and since then, you're getting basically a swath of sound, so a fan of sound going out. And by going back and forth and overlapping these, you can basically build a really good 3D model of the seafloor. And that's what we're working with today as a modern mapping technology. I wanted to acknowledge that there's been evidence documented of the occurrence of important cold water coral habitats since as early as 1962. So this is a reference to a paper that was published there by Stetson et al. And I really found it interesting from this article. They were basically using that single beam echo sounder technology to make a model of these pinnacles that they found in their echo sounder data. So they had relatively crude mapping technologies available to them, but they were still understanding that these pinnacles were out there and were providing really important coral habitat. Since that time, many researchers working off the Southeast region have done extensive work to discover new coral mound features, explore new areas, and really documenting the ecological importance of these regions by understanding what type of habitat they provide to many types of fish and invertebrates. So just a quick snapshot of what we're actually talking about here. What do these coral mounds look like when they're healthy? This is actually living coral. So unlike shallow water reefs, when you see the white coral here, this is actually healthy living tissue of this species of reef-building coral. Eric will talk more about this, but just to give you a visual sense of the complexity of habitat that they provide and really an important place for other species to live and thrive. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through some evolution of how this area has been mapped since the 1990s. So how did we get to where we are today in our knowledge of the region? So this was taken straight from the publicly available bathymetric data viewer that NOAA maintains through the National Centers for Environmental Information. And basically starting in 1990, you can see these green tracks as showing you where a ship went during an expedition. And those back and forth zigzag patterns are where they did a multi-beam mapping survey and what the footprint of knowledge that came from that in terms of mapping information was. So you can see in 1990, very little, just a few surveys out in deep water. I should mention this doesn't reflect shallow water surveys that are being done. But out in deep water in 2000, you see there's a few more, but largely the vast majority of the Blake Plateau is still unmapped, and therefore we really don't know what the shape of the seafloor is there in detail. By 2010, you can see that there's some important work being done both in deep water off the continental shelf to the east, and as well as shallower waters in the western portion of the Blake Plateau. And so these are some of the really key surveys that revealed that indeed there were dense corals here, really impressive mound features of global significance. So the researchers in this region really realized that what was needed was a sustained campaign to really explore the rest of the Blake Plateau systematically to reveal the full nature and extent and number of coral mounds that this region supports. So by 2024, the map on the right, basically the vast majority of the plateau has been mapped. And that's the data I'll be presenting momentarily. This was really made possible by a campaign primarily in 2017 through 2019. This was a NOAA-led campaign, NOAA Ocean Exploration, and partners, others in the federal government and academia, completed 16 expeditions out to this area to systematically map it and explore, as well as the deep search expedition. Eric Cortez, the next speaker, was the leader of that collaborative effort, which is really aimed more at understanding some of this ecological importance of these areas. So the point being, until recently, we didn't really have the technology, we didn't have the resources and the ship time to dedicate it to explore this area right off the East Coast, which is remarkable if you think about how much we've discovered in a relatively short time. So this is our current map of the Blake Plateau, taking 31 different ocean expeditions, different ships, and putting it all in one map. So this is a topographic model of the Blake Plateau. And what you immediately notice is the left side and the north side has a lot of kind of complex terrain and topography. And then as we move to the east, it becomes a much flatter area. I should mention that this white box that you see superimposed is the habitat area protection, habitat of particular concern established by the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. So what do we have here? What does it actually look like when you look at the model, the 3D model of the seafloor and what do these features actually appear? So you can see that these linear chains of features, these are actually cold water coral mounds. So we've proven this by diving on them with submersibles. So various researchers have gone out with both manned and unmanned submersibles and documented that these are actually those cold water coral mounds. The recent work that we did was to compile all this data. So the top shows you all these mounds, thousands and thousands that you can see, those little bumps. And then we used a system where we could actually classify the terrain into these different landforms, which is really to draw out the sort of slopes and the ridges and the peaks. And this allowed us to count how many coral mounds there were across the terrain in an automated way, and to really understand where these the densest aggregations of mounds across the plateau. So the map on the left, again, is this synthesis of the bathymetric data, and the map on the right is this interpretive landforms. So what you can see on the right is that sort of light yellow color is showing you where essentially the terrain is flat. And then the topography of the terrain really jumps out in terms of the slopes and the ridges and the peaks of these features, many of which are formed in this region by these reefs that form over time, many generations of coral building up these mound structures. So quickly, you can see that there's a large concentration of these coral structures on the western side of the plateau, as well as in the north. And then there's some sparse areas that are still important in the rest of the region. So the bottom line here is, what did we learn from this in terms of a quick summary? We did document, as was known earlier on, that the Blake Plateau has the largest known coral reef habitat in the world, which is very astounding, and really the global importance of this is hard to overstate. We have nearly continuous cold water coral mountain region. So this is this black hashed polygon that you see on the right is this nearly continuous stretch of coral, 500 kilometers long and up to 110 kilometers wide. We're talking about an area here about 7 million acres. So by comparison, that's about 3 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. That white polygon you see on the right is this dense area of really tightly packed coral mounds, so really extraordinary. And that's about 1.2 million acres in size. So that's larger than Grand Canyon National Park, just to give you a sense of the scale of these features. And this method revealed about 83,908 potential cold water coral mounds, many of which we know from the way they look in the mapping and then are confirmed with later dives that they actually are formed by these reef building corals. So with that, I'll end my portion of the presentation and be happy to answer questions during the question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. That was really interesting, and we'll skip right on over to Dr. Cordes to hear about the corals. And just a reminder for people to put questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Jim, Queen Quet, and Derek for that wonderful introduction to these really amazing habitats. Derek just did a great job summarizing these areas, and just to look at this again, the size of the areas of dense mounds is around the size of Maryland. These mounds are 150 meters high or 500 feet high, about the height of the Washington Monument. And a lot of features that size in other parts of the ocean, in the other parts of the Atlantic, have been aged at over 1 million years. So these coral features have been here for a very, very long time. The deep ocean in general, and not just these coral reefs, but the entire Blake Plateau, does a lot for us. Of course, we get a lot of extractive resources from it, oil and gas, fisheries, a lot of blue energy, which is coming online more and more these days, wind farms that are being sited out in this area, the potential for ocean thermal energy conversion, for wave energy. There are a lot of different ways that we can extract some of the energy of the ocean and help to power our communities. It also gives us carbon sequestration. So the majority of the CO2 that's entering the atmosphere historically has ended up into the ocean, and then it ends up in the deep sea in a variety of different ways. And the deep sea is usually treated as a big blank slate and a big sort of black box that all this carbon falls into and then disappears. And I'm going to explain a little why that may not be exactly correct. There's a lot of nutrient regeneration that happens. So when all that material comes down, the corals are, and the species associated with them, including all the microbes, are turning that back into nutrients. And then those nutrients are upwelled back to the surface, and the nutrients are driving the productivity of the North Atlantic. There are a lot of genetic resources that are being tapped these days, looking for gene products, natural products that from deep water corals and sponges have gone on to be pharmaceuticals to treat cancer, to treat AIDS, and a variety of other important diseases. And of course, the cultural resources, which you just heard a lot about, and just the aesthetic quality, which hopefully I can help convey. And we really need to maintain these services or augment them in the future. We're facing a critical time right now where we can't just start losing some of these surfaces from the deep ocean through our lack of foresight. We have a chance here to do something that can help preserve these habitats before industry really intensifies in some of these deep areas. And again, the function of our entire blue economy, our civilization, really relies on the deep ocean and the services it provides. So as Derek mentioned, as part of the Deep Search Project, which I was a government contractor as an academic for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We partner with the U.S. Geological Survey through the and NOAA Ocean Exploration, and also the Deep Sea Coral Research and Technology Program through the National Oceanographic Partnership Program, NOP. And we, over 5 years, spent a lot of time out there, contributed to the mapping in the area, and got to see a lot of these habitats firsthand. And we've been slowly getting a lot more of this information out into the public through the academic literature, and of course with the help of the NRDC to get it out in the public. So this is what these habitats look like. These are typical coral mounds in this area. They are, as I said, extensive, 150 meters high. They can be a kilometer across. In some areas, they've coalesced into these very long ridges that can stretch for hundreds of kilometers if you were to add them all up. This is one of the NOAA remotely operated vehicles on one of those coral mounds, so you can get a sense of scale. In 2018, I was lucky enough to visit these in the Alvin submersible from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And this is some of the footage from that dive where we really got a firsthand look. And as Derek said, we need to go back and ground truth a lot of these observations. We have great predictive models that I'll show you in a second, and a lot of the models that Derek showed you that suggest where these mounds are, what might be there. But we really need to verify that there are living corals there, and corals that provide habitat for a lot of these other associated species. There are shallow water species, commercially fished species like this swordfish that can occasionally attack submarines. So our pilot gave it a little nap, a little touch on the tail there to kind of scare them off. But we've spent a lot of time documenting all the other species that live along with them and all of the ecosystem services they provide. In this video, you can see that shimmering appearance is real. That is the heat coming down from the surface into the deep ocean. The Gulf Stream rips through here very, very quickly, 5-6 nautical miles an hour at the surface, and that translates down to depth. That means that that heat that's at the surface is being translated down to depth and being sequestered just like the carbon's being sequestered in the deep ocean. It's the ocean is pulling it out of the atmosphere, sending it down to the deep sea. And the deep sea can hold a lot of energy, a lot of that heat, because it constitutes 95% of the living space on our planet. That heat, that carbon ends up down there and it gets pulled out of the coupled ocean atmosphere system and prevents us from experiencing a lot of that. And so we conducted a lot of experiments. That one of the issues with the heat going down there is that these corals can't necessarily tolerate that. The deep sea tends to be a fairly stable environment. And we've now seen marine heat waves reaching these sites that have elevated the temperature 10 to 12 degrees Celsius over a matter of hours within a single day. And so you can get very drastic changes that are starting to happen. So the exploration that we need to do to get down there, to learn more about these corals, to figure out what kinds of things they can stand, how much carbon they're actually sequestering and where that's happening. The deep sea isn't a featureless plain down there. There are canyons, there are mountains, there are these huge coral reefs. And where those ecosystem services are being generated happen in different places. And one of those is on the Blake Plateau because of the coupling through the Gulf Stream and these massive coral reefs that we now understand are this size. We've known corals have been there for decades, but now we know just how many there are. And the nutrients they're pumping out, the carbon that they're sequestering, those ecosystem services are much more intense over these coral reefs than they are in other areas. So it's very important that before we proceed to exploitation of deep sea resources in this area, that we do a lot of exploration and the preservation of these habitats. And there are more out there. What you're looking at on the left here is a predictive habitat model that shows where these corals are likely to be. And we've verified some of these, but this is the area that Derek was referring to that we've been talking about. But these corals are in even more extensive habitats in the Blake Plateau than we currently understand. So there's a lot more work to be done, but we already are beginning to see in lots of different ways, as you've heard today, the value of this really precious national treasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was amazing amount of information. Because we're 4 minutes to the end of our panel, Queen Quet is going to kindly put the link to the video that she produced in the chat. so you can watch it later if you'd like to. And we can take a few questions that have shown up in the Q&A. We have one question from Tim. What was the geographic origin of ancient coral reefs? And Eric, could you take that question? Or Queen Quet, either one of you. You both mentioned
Oh,
the
sorry.
age of the reefs.
Yeah, I was still on mute. It's a very good question. The truth is we don't really know. The hard corals that form these reefs likely first evolved in shallow water. That's not true for all coral groups, but we think that is true for these. And the center of biodiversity of corals in shallow water and deep water is in the Southwest Pacific. So that's probably where the origin was, but we're talking about many tens to hundreds of millions of years ago. With glaciation, these reefs have disappeared from some waters and appeared in others. We think that they've stayed in the Blake Plateau for more than those cycles, so at least tens to possibly hundreds of thousands of years, maybe millions of years. Comparable structures in the Gulf of Mexico are over 3 million years, 300,000 years. Comparable structures in the North Atlantic are 1 million years. So they go back a long ways, and they are found throughout the entire world.
Great, thank you. Queen Quet, we have a question for you. The question says, I'm an early career scientist working on a write-up about the Blake Plateau. What are the ways which we can honor the spiritual significance of this area in scientific publications? Is there even an appropriate medium to do so?
Well, the most appropriate medium, of course, is to have some of the videos or other things embedded into things if this was an online publication. However, I know the limitations if we're doing a lot of academic publications, those usually go in academic journals. So you might want to do some citations. There are a number of different links that I have at Geechee.tv, and there'll be others. And we're going to drop one that's going to talk more about the overall cultural heritage connections to Gullah Geechee, and you're welcome to always use that. That'll be in the chat and available to everyone. But definitely, if there are opportunities for you to connect to some of the other videos of us actually doing spiritual ceremonies on the Atlantic Ocean, those would be good things to acknowledge, to cite, to include, especially if you're doing something that will allow for engageable links, as we would say, on the internet itself, in addition to what you would put in another publication. But the very fact that you would mention this, that there is that spiritual component and that there is a living cultural heritage group directly attached to it every day, because I literally live in the Atlantic Ocean on the Sea Islands, that would go a long way within academia, because that part is often left out.
Thank you. Okay, we have a third question. What opportunities are there to combine the observational data from deep sea surveys with the embodied and traditional knowledge of the Gullah Geechee to advocate for protecting of this plateau?
Oh, another one for me.
That's another one for you. And also I think Dr. Delgado can speak to this in his work on, honoring historical events. So both of you, love to hear from that.
Yes, absolutely. The other opportunities that I would mention is that in the chat, I already dropped GullahGeecheeNation.com. We have a number of different events and activities throughout the year, but especially annually, we host the Coastal Cultures Conference. And so next year, our conference is going to have a centerpiece around this topic about how important Blake Plateau is to us spiritually and culturally because of this space being the Middle Passage. So you'll have opportunities where you can join in with some of our partners, such as Black and Marine Science, who we always couple the scientific, the cultural, the spiritual, and our traditional ecological knowledge. All of these things are one for us, but we know those are the different terminologies that are used within these arenas. So all of that is brought together in one circle, in one space. And so you can fully engage and fully experience this, and then learn more about what accurate Gullah Geechee history is, because you can't learn that from TikTok. I am on there too, though, at Gullah Geechee Nation, but you can't learn all what you need to know about something as sacred as this by looking at those online videos. You have to come to where we are and fully experience it, and then be able to present that in other arenas. So I welcome you to follow us so that you'll know when we have the Coastal Cultures Conference, and come and join us there, and then at other events that we'll have around this topic throughout the year.
Thank you, Queen Quet. And Dr. Delgado, I know this is something that is near and dear to your heart and your scholarship.
I think the most important thing to follow up on those very powerful words from Queen Quet is that the importance for us as archaeologists, with the science that we do, is to understand that what we're looking at is a human history, and that inclusivity is absolutely not only essential, but it is the very basic nature of human beings, unless we pretend otherwise. And so with that, I think the power of working together, not only acknowledging, but integrating that knowledge and that history as people have lived it, is important. And I guess my final word on that is that in many ways and in many cases, what we look at when we look specifically at a shipwreck is more than just something out of a history book. It's more than something in a newspaper. It's more than is seen as something that's historical. What we're talking about is family history, not just from the larger human family, but of specific families who in many cases may never know what happened. But with something like this Blake Ridge wreck, what we powerfully believe is that at some stage, whether it's spiritual or not, the spirits of those down there most likely have some satisfaction in knowing that that wreck has finally been found, if that is your belief. And it is actually my belief as well. The spiritual world connects us powerfully to the past, just as surely does what our technology allows us to see when we're down there.
Okay, so I want to thank the panelists for joining us today and sharing with us their expertise. It was incredibly interesting, and I want to thank you all for joining. And we will see you later in some other conversation about the Blake Plateau. Bye, everyone.